Haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph at the new Mishnah. The Tana focuses his attention on the mitzvah of Achilas Matzah, Ba'erev Toichlu Matzos. On the first night of Pesach, one is obligated to eat matzah. Says the Tana, Eilu Dvarim She'odam Yotzei Bahen Yodei Choivosoi Ba'Pesach. These are the following types of grains that one can use to fulfill his mitzvah of eating matzah on the first night of Pesach. Bechitin, wheat. Besa'orin, with barley. Bekusmin, with spelt. Beshifoin, with rye. Ubeshibolesh shual, and with oats. All of these 5 grains can be used for one's obligation for eating matzah on Leil HaSeder. V'yoitzin b'demai. And the Mishnah goes on to say a list of things that one is yotzei with. He's yotzei with demai, even though demai, do-ma, what is it? In other words, the Chachamim were concerned that an Am Haaretz would not take proper maasros from the grains, and therefore they required the person who buys from an Am Haaretz to then maaser. However, they were mekil because since roiv Amei Haaretz maaserin hein, the majority of Amei Haaretz do take maaser. They said that if a person is an ani, for example, then the ani does not have to then go ahead and take that maaser. So over here, because of the kula, the leniency when it comes to demai, that if a person wanted, technically he could be mafkir his nechas and become an ani. So therefore, the demai that was used to make the matzah would be something that would be viable and permissible on Pesach. The maaser rishon shenot l'trumosoi. Here we're talking about when it comes to then a person who then has grains, he then has a field, he harvests the field, he then takes the grains. So there's a process. If he's finished with the processing of the grain by harvesting and winnowing it, and he makes it into a pile, he smooths it out, he begins now, it takes that grain which is now tevel, and he has to then take trumas and maasros. The very first obligation is to give truma, which is called truma gedola, to the kohen, after which he gives maaser rishon to the Levi. Now the Levi then takes trumas maaser, 1/10 of that maaser that he was given, and gives that to the kohen called trumas maaser. So over here we're talking about where it says maaser rishon shenitla trumasoi. Well, it sounds like the maaser rishon, and you took the truma from the maaser rishon. I mean, the Levi took trumas maaser from it. What's the problem? Sounds very good. So the chiddush of the Mishnah is that the Levi took the grain before truma gedola was given to the kohen by the bailim of the grain. So the chiddush over here is that since over here it was not yet made into a kri, it was not made into a pile and smoothed out, whereby it didn't become chayiv and trumas maasers yet. So when the Levi took the grain from the bailim, and he took his maaser out, even though it was before the bailim gave truma gedola to the kohen, it still is valid. In other words, no longer does truma gedola have to be taken out, and therefore such grain can be used for matzah. The Mishnah goes on to say another thing that can be used for matzah: maaser sheni v'hekdesh niftu, maaser sheni grain and hekdesh that was niftu. Of course, again, what's the chiddush? If one took those grains that were outside of Yerushalayim and was poida them, so then what's the problem? You can take that money, go into Yerushalayim, and then buy food with it and eat in Yerushalayim. But over here we're talking about they were poida, but they did not add a chomesh. V'hakohanim bechala v'truma. Here it states kohanim. Although these are grains, these are only things that are valid for kohanim, truma and chala. Nonetheless, a kohen can use this for his matzah. The Mishnah now brings us a list of those things that cannot be used for matzah. Aval loy betevel, tevel cannot be used for his matzah grain, and that's of course again pshita. The Gemara will ask, and the answer is that tevel over here is talking about tevel midirabanan. Taking a atzitz she'eino nokuf, when you have a flower pot that does not have any holes, it's not perforated, such a flower pot itself is only tevel midrabanan, and here still you cannot use it. Here we're talking about where there's already now a kri, there was a pile of grain, it was a gemar malacha, and it was smoothed out, now it was tevel, ready to be taken trumas and meises from. And still, the Levi took his meiser rishon before the Bailim gave truma gedoyla to the kohen. So here now makes the grain that the Levi has off limits, whereby he cannot use it for the matzah. Here we're talking about where the meiser sheni and hekdesh were not niftu. If that's so, again, seems to be obvious you cannot use it for your grain. The answer is it was niftu without the proper pidyon. In other words, they did pipoide. In other words, the pidyon of the meiser sheni was done with a matbeya, which is what's normally required, but normally what's required is a matbeya with a tzura. And here he was poide with a matbeya that was an asimoin that did not have a tzura, and therefore it's an invalid pidyon. So too, when it comes to hekdesh, you have to be poide the hekdesh with metaltalin, movable objects. Instead, he was poide with property, with real property, with karka. So it's invalid. The Mishnah goes on to say, chalois hatoida rutike nazir. If you have chalois hatoida, the toida offering also requires not only the carbon, but also certain loaves. And some of those loaves are matzos. Similarly, rutike nazir, the nazir also has 10 matzos that are used for the nazir. So it says, it depends. Oson la'atzmon ein yotzi behen. If they were made for the purpose of the nazir himself, or for the toida, it was made for this purpose, so that it was not made lishmon, for the sake of matzah, and therefore it's invalid. However, oson limkor b'shuk yotzin ban. If a person made it, so then he wanted to sell it in the shuk to a nazir, or to somebody who's bringing a carbon toida, he had already in mind that in the event that he does not sell it to the nazir or the one who's bringing the carbon toida, he will use it for his matzos, then it is lishmon, and therefore it's valid for his matzah. Says the Gemara, bringing out the following brayso, Tana kusmin min chitin. Kusmin spelled is a species of wheat. Shiboiles shual v'shifoin min soirin. Oat and rye is a species of barley. In other words, there's a nafka mina that although when it comes to truma, you cannot take truma from one species onto the next. So you'll not be able to take your truma from your chitin by taking out sa'arin, but you could take kusmin for the chitin. And similarly, you can take your shual, your shibah shual and your shifon for your sa'arin, because it's considered to be a valid species of sa'arin, of barley. The Brisa goes on to say, kusmin, it identifies as gulba, shifoin, rye, dishra, shiboila shual, shivile tala, the tail of a fox, because it's long, elongated, the way the grain appears. Says the Gemara, hani in, these, yes, meaning these 5 grains, a person can go ahead and fulfill his obligation with matzah on the first night of Pesach. Aval orez v'doichen loy, but orez, rice, and doichen, buckwheat, lo, he cannot use that for his grains to make matzah. Menohani mili, the Gemara now wants to know, where do you know that orez and doichen cannot be used? Om Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish v'chein Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael v'chein Dana debei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Omar Kro, the pasuk states, Loi soichal alov chametz, you shall not eat chametz. Shivas yomim toichal alov matzos. For 7 days, if you want to eat bread, it must be matzah. So from here we learn out, from the hekesh, the comparison in the same pasuk between chametz and matzah, dvarim shabayim lidei chimutz, those things, those grains that will bring to a leavening, adam yoytze ben yidei chavasav matzah, a person can use that to then bake matzahs with and fulfill his obligation of eating matzahs. Yotzu elu she'ein boyin lidei chimutz ela lidei sirochon. To exclude these, that means orez and doichan, that do not bring to a proper leavening, rather to a spoilage. And therefore they cannot be used for your matzah on Leil HaSeder. Mas Nisin, the Gemara points out, our Mishnah, the loy kerabi Yochanan ben Nuri. Therefore, our Mishnah does not follow the Shita, the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The Omar Orez min doganhu. Because Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said that Orez is a type of grain. And therefore, v'chayovin al chimutzay kares. He says, like one of the other 5 grains, whereby a person will be chayiv kares for the leavening of such Orez. The Tanya, it states in the Brisa his opinion. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri oiser ba'orez v'doichan mipnei shekarev lahachmitz. He said both orez and doichan, those are things that a person will be chayiv kares because it's karev lahachmitz. Ask the Gemara, iboiluhu. What did he mean when he said that it's karev lahachmitz? Shekarev lahachmitz dekadim umachmitz. Did he mean to say that it's something that will quickly become leavened? Or dilma karev lahachmitz have? Or it's something that just comes close to leavening. Chametz gamur lehavi, but it never becomes actual chametz gamur. Toshma, let's bring a raya. What his kavanah was when he says karv lahachmitz. The Tanya, it states in the Brisa, Omar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, orez min doganhu. Orez is a type of grain. V'chayovin al chimutzoy kares. And one is obligated for the orez, if it becomes leavened, he's chayiv kares. And a person will, yes, be able to then use that for his grain on matzah, on Leil HaSeder. So here we see Mefurash that he said, when he said Korov lahachmitz, he meant that it quickly becomes chametz, because you can indeed use it for matzah, and you will indeed be chayiv kores if it becomes leavened. V'chein haya Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri oimer, and similarly, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, Kromis chayeves bechala. Kromis is chayeves bechala. And by the way, for something to be obligated in taking out challah, it has to have the same requirement to be able to be used for matzah. My kromis, what the Gemara asks, is kromis that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says is chayeves bechala, whereby he would also say that it would be valid for matzah. Omar Abaye shitzanisa. He says it's shanisa. What is shanisa? Ma shitzanisa. Omar Papa shitzanisa. The mishtacha beine kalonisa. It's found amongst the pereg, the type of poppy seeds. This type of seed is found there, and when it's ground, it can also be used as flour for your matzah. And therefore, it's also obligated in challah. Omar Rabbi Barachan, Omar B'Yesh Lakish, Isa sheni loisha beyayin v'shemen udvash. If you have dough that is kneaded with wine, with oil, with honey, ein chayovin al chimutzay kares. Reish Lakish says he's not going to be obligated if it becomes then what seems to be leavened. He will not be chayiv kares. Yossi Rav Papa Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua Kamed Rav Idi Bar Avin. Rav Papa and Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua were sitting in front of Rav Idi Bar Avin. V'Yossi Rav Idi Bar Avin v'Kamenanim, and Rav Idi Bar Naamin was sitting there, and he drove. He then was falling asleep. Omar le Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua le Rav Papa. Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua said to Rav Papa, "My time with Reish Lakish. Why did Reish Lakish say when one kneads dough with either grape juice, with oil, or with honey, is not going to be chayiv kares when it becomes chametz? What's the reason? Omar le domakro. Rav Papa brings the pasuk, as we saw before, lo soichal alav chametz. One cannot eat chametz, and the rest of the pasuk goes on to say, for 7 days, if a person wants to eat bread, he must eat matzah. So he explains, Dvarim she'adam yoytze behen yidei chayvase b'matzah chayavin al chimutzay kares. Now Rav Papa explains what we said before in the other direction. He says, a person who is going to fulfill his obligation in matzah, with those grains, he will be chayiv, it's chametz, if it comes leavened on Pesach, he'll be chayiv kares. That's how Rav Papa learns. And these things that we had just mentioned, when it's going to be kneaded, the dough is going to be kneaded with grape juice or wine with honey or with oil, he's not going to be able to fulfill his obligation of matzah on Pesach. Then ein chayav na chimutza kares, he will not also be obligated the punishment of kares if it becomes leavened on Pesach. Eisvei Rav Huna ber Rav Yeshua Rav Papa. Rav Huna ber Yeshua, he turns now to Rav Papa and he questions him and he says, Himchahu v'gamu, if the grain became dissolved and he swallowed one of the grains, that would be normally something that is chayiv, that's normally something that he is going to eat matzah on Pesach with, and he, instead of eating it, he dissolved it in liquid in water, and he swallowed it. So he basically drank it down. He swallowed it. It's not derech achila, it's not considered to be fulfilling ba'erev toichlu matzos. On the first night of Pesach, one is obligated to eat matzos. So he's not going to fulfill his obligation of eating matzah. Yet, Rav Huna ber Rav Yeshua points out, Im chometz hu onush karetz. But if he does do that, if he's going to swallow this dissolved grain that is leavened, then he will be chayiv kares. Hu ein adam yotze b'dei chavasa b'Pesach. Yet he will not fulfill his obligation of eating matzah on Pesach. So you see that your limud is faulty, he says to Rav Papa, because over here it's not totally zeh b'zeh. Because over here he's not going to fulfill his obligation of eating matzah, yet he will be chayiv kares. If he would eat such grain, he would dissolve it and swallow it down. Itar buhu Rav Idi bar Avin. The Gemara points out now that Rav Idi bar Avin, who dozed off, now wakes up, and he says, Omar Lu, he says to Rav Huna ber Rav Yoshua and Rav Papa Dardiki, he calls them young ones. Hainu taimo de Reish Lakish. He now explains what is the reason why Reish Lakish said what he said. When one kneads dough with wine, with oil, or with honey, that he's not going to be chayev for its chimutz kares, is mishum dahavalu mei peiros, because this is considered to be mei peiros. And when you knead with mei peiros, it doesn't become leavened. It doesn't become chametz.